Global Voices on Taiwan. Welcome back to Global Voices on Taiwan. I'm Rath Wang, a news producer and host.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vincent Chao. I'm the director of the DPP's Department of International Affairs. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be exploring with you on how the latest world events from near and afar, how they impact Taiwan, and how this island nation shakes the world. We invite international journalists, experts, and policymakers to talk about Taiwan and share their thoughts on current events here.
Joining us today is Cleo Paskal from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Cleo is a senior fellow and expert on Indo-Pacific security, previously also at the UK's Chatham House and India's Gateway House, both the most prestige foreign policy think tanks in their nations. She is also an investigative journalist as the North American Special Correspondent in India's Sunday Guardian. Thanks for coming on, Cleo. You've talked extensively and shared with me as well on, quote, why securing India against China matters to the world. Can you talk about what that means in the context of Taiwan, given how India is a bit far away from Taiwan in terms of geographic distance?
India might seem far from Taiwan, but if you're in China, they're both neighbors, and they're both strategic threats in a way that is almost existential. Both of them represent successful democracies that undercut the justification for the Chinese Communist Party. And in the case of Taiwan, it shows that people of ethnic Han origin can certainly handle democracy and do wonderful things with it. And in the case of India, it shows that a country of over 1 billion people can be successfully run, not by an authoritarian dictatorship, but again, through democracy. So it may seem, if you're looking Taiwan from India or at India from Taiwan, you may seem far away, but if you're looking at China and going out, they're both actually not just neighbors, but existential threats to the justification of the Chinese Communist Party. And as such, the Indian strategic community understands very well that should the Chinese Communist Party try to go after Taiwan and invade and subsume it, India is going to be next, or vice versa. So they see the strategic linkage as incredibly strong. And that's why, for example, you recently had former chiefs of defense branches going to Taiwan. And that was public, but I think there's a lot of other things that are happening that aren't as public.
Well, Cleo, thanks for sharing that. And I mean, if we kind of take a few steps back and start by looking at India's role in the Indo-Pacific policy or Indo-Pacific strategy, I am curious your thoughts. What does India seek to benefit in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, why have they become such a critical pillar of the strategy? And certainly, what do you see in terms of prospects going forward and how India can or will or may play a larger role kind of here in the region?
So if you're going to currently, because of the way China is interacting, which is, I would argue, a very aggressive and disruptive way, if you're going to grow your own economy, you have to do two things. First, you have to block the malign influence, and then you have to build your economy in your own way, with your own ownership to it. And India has been very good at both. So they're very good at understanding how Chinese political warfare works. They've seen it happen in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives, in Seychelles, in Nepal, in Myanmar, all around them, they can see this happening, and they're very good at countering it. So they, after the battle in Galwan, where the PLA troops attacked the Chinese troops in June 2020, one of the first major retaliations from the Indian side 2 weeks later was banning TikTok and WeChat. They know how the political warfare works. So that's the blocking. On the other side, they're trying to build in a very comprehensive way, bringing in allies and giving economic alternatives to being sucked into Beijing's economic orbit. And you saw that very clearly at the recent G20, which was hosted in India, where India really made a big effort over the whole year to host different events in different parts of India, to do think tanks, policy papers, and even to make sure that the African Union was included as a full member of the G20, to try to create these linkages that are not beholden to Beijing, but also not beholden to some of those Western economic models that also haven't necessarily benefited them completely, especially if you're an emerging market. So creating these alternatives, and it's not a non-alignment, it's a realignment within the context of an international rules-based order, but on terms that are more viable for emerging economies. Because if you can grow your economy, your democracy becomes much more resilient, and things can grow up based on that. So they're helping in the context of the Indo-Pacific in two areas that are essential for most of the countries in the Indo-Pacific, which is political warfare, blocking of malign influence, and on the economic front, creating new alternatives that can bypass these other systems that haven't been helpful, especially in the context of China, BRI, that sort of thing.
What about in the context of the G20? We've seen India take a leadership role in the absence of China. Do you feel, what implications does that have in terms of the region and for Taiwan?
The Chinese absence was, so Xi Jinping didn't go to that final meeting. There were other Chinese representatives there, but China doesn't play well with others. The model that India is proposing is much more of a collaborative. The motto was one planet, one family, one future, one earth, one family, one future. Very much we can all grow together. Whereas the Chinese model is much more, it all centers, it hubs, and China's this
top down.
Yeah, and you've got the spokes, right? So China really couldn't, if Xi Jinping would have shown up in Delhi, if you can imagine it, he would have been playing second fiddle to the host, which does not work in that CCP mindset. So because of the way that they've set up the structure and the way that they interact with other countries, they actually can't collaborate in that way. And so he couldn't show up. They put out the map that claims everything, and then he didn't show up. So it was a very clear demonstration of two different visions of how countries can work together and a model for the Indo-Pacific. What does it mean for Taiwan? As countries start to have more economic options and independence, that gives more latitude for defending themselves, like you're seeing happen with the Philippines, and more, I would hope, more latitude for collaboration with Taiwan, which is something that's in everybody's best security interests. And if you're as a leader of a country like the Philippines or wherever, if you can create enough domestic stability so that you can withstand the internal political warfare that China will throw at you, then it makes it more easy to create more overt linkages with Taiwan.
Great. And just following up on this issue, so I think what we've seen, and you mentioned this delegation of Indian former security officials, but what we've seen in recent years is this growing relationship between Taiwan and India. And that's been, I think, focused a bit on trade, a bit on security, a bit on people-to-people relations, technical exchanges, and all taken together. I do think we've seen robust examples of how this relationship can come together. And I'm curious, how you see the outlook for this relationship. What are some of the things that India is going to look for in terms of building this relationship? What do they expect? How could this benefit both countries? And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that, Cleo.
The first time I went to Taiwan, which was probably about 15 years ago, or give or take, there was an Indian delegation in town meeting with Taiwanese officials. And but it was being done through kind of Indian Americans and Taiwanese American. They were kind of fronting the conversation. And the discussion was quite frank. And the context of the discussion was, from an Indian perspective, we don't want a lot of Chinese investment in India. We know what comes along with that Chinese investment, but we need economic growth. So we like Taiwan as an independent country, but we don't care about Taiwan because you don't care about India. So if Taiwan invests in India, which would help Taiwan companies because you're pulling out of that susceptible Chinese supply chain anyway, that would give us a way of building this relationship and giving us an economic alternative to China. That was the argument. And so you create these economic corridors that help build trust and give political will for strategic engagement. What started to happen, and that did start to happen to a certain degree, but what we saw, for example, with the Taiwanese plant that was iPhone parts manufacturing plant that was attacked in Bengaluru recently, was Taiwanese didn't want to come to India to work in particularly large numbers. And so in the case of I think it was a Windstrom plant, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be mistaken, they were bringing in mainland Chinese as managers. And
culture clash.
Yeah, well, they have potentially different priorities. So there is not necessarily, if you are a mainland, if you're from China and the Chinese Communist Party has control over your life back at home, which they do, and part of your remit is to make sure that this factory isn't a success, and you'll be rewarded when you go back home for making sure the factory isn't a success, because that factory is direct threat to China's control over global supply chains. You want to make India look like it's a failure in terms of replacing China in global supply chains. Then your motivation for making that plant functional might be very different. So there was this attack at this plant that was sort of linked to labor issues, but there's a very big question about whether the entire situation was at least in part manufactured or spurred on by interests that wanted to see it fail. So the Taiwanese investors may want one thing, but unless there's a complete vertical everybody on message for why they're doing what they're doing, then there's openings for this, as I mentioned initially, this malign influence. You have to block the malign influence and then you can build. So in some cases, it's been very successful in India, but everything that is a success between Taiwan and India is a threat to Beijing. So unless you also incorporate the blocking while you're building, you're going to have situations like the one we saw, whether it was directly related to that as a cause or not. That's consistent with the sort of you'd expect Beijing to want to happen in that relationship.
Cleo, I wanted to draw attention to another area of your many expertises, the Pacific Islands. Maintaining peace and stability is in the interest of everyone here. And Taiwan's an island nation. It's part of the Indo-Pacific. You recently wrote, "Time to Close China's Backdoor in the U.S." And one area of particular interest is the Solomon Islands, which we believe you just came back from. Do they regret switching ties from Taiwan to China?
Well, and I think, to be clear, I think the people of the Solomon Islands, I mean, how did they view the situation, in light of what's happening in Honiara these days?
It was never put to public opinion. It was not part of a campaign platform. There were commissions that were put together by the government that were ignored. It was initially a very small group of people, including the prime minister, that decided to do the switch. Now, this comes to, and in some cases, like the entire province of Malaita, after the switch in 2019, issued a communique saying, we don't want to deal with CCP-linked businesses operating in our province. And they give a whole bunch of reasons, including we believe in freedom of religion, and we're very concerned about, China's how China interacts with with people of faith, that sort of things. But what happens when you have countries, this is more a question for you guys, when you have countries, the Pacific Islands are good examples, that switch or recognize Taiwan, the PRC never goes away. They keep people on the ground. They keep looking for opportunities. They keep building those relationships. But when the Solomons switched, almost all of the Taiwanese stuff packed up and went home. There was only the case of when the premier Malaita province got sick, and the Australians wouldn't help. Nobody would help him. But President Tsai personally, out of compassion and humanitarian intervention, got involved and made sure that he could come to Taiwan and get the healthcare that he needed. But what would have been ideal is then he gets sent back with the sort of medical equipment that, and training for for Solomon Islanders, that could mean that his people, which is what he really wanted, could get similar kind of healthcare. It's not that expensive, but this is a kind of a question for you guys, which is, there was a case, for example, very clear case with the Federated States of Micronesia, where the president wrote a letter explaining, and detailing why he wanted to recognize Taiwan.
Yeah.
And then nothing happened. So what do you, I have my own theories, but what do you think about those sorts of situations?
Well, I mean, frankly speaking, in the case of FSM, I think it was President Panuelo, and I think he was at the very, very end of his term. And I think at that point, he was already confirmed to be an outgoing president. And so I think the political difficulties were present, regardless of what he had stated within that letter in terms of not only public opinion, but sort of the new administration coming in. And I think more broadly speaking, it's this. I mean, I've been to Honiara a number of times. I've been across the Pacific, and the Chinese have a fairly large presence in countries, and like you mentioned, I mean, it's within our diplomatic allies as well. And when they don't actually have diplomatic representation, they're represented through state-owned enterprises. They're represented through other interlocutors that they work through. And what we find is that it's actually very hard to compete, not because of resourcing in general, but because of the ways that they compete. And they're so antithesis to everything we're used to as a democracy, but also a country that engages closely with Australia, New Zealand, and other like-minded partners in the region. And in case of the Solomon Islands, for example, it was really a matter of money changing hands, and I think this has been well documented at this point, and which had opened up a floodgate of security interests from the PRC in the Solomon Islands, including the building of a naval base, including the positioning of security forces, including supporting with armed training their police forces that have had a past history of controversy in Honiara. And I think while we can engage piecemeal, it becomes very difficult for us to compete with that without compromising our own ideals and morals and our way of conducting diplomacy. So that's not a perfect answer, but it's, I think, something that we think about often as we think about sort of diplomatic competition there.
Yeah, and this is kind of the trying to build without the blocking, and Taiwan is in a very there are a lot of honest people in places like Solomon's who, as you said, money changed hands, but they can't prove it. They can't track the money. They can't read the Chinese documents. It's very hard for them to prove it. And so, and one would have hoped, because, for example, a lot of the Chinese bribe money then gets laundered through Australia or New Zealand, but Australia and New Zealand aren't doing anything about it. A lot of that leadership in Solomon's could be brought up on charges in Australia very easily for corrupt practices, and have their visas denied and their bank accounts seized. And because currently there's no downside to taking PRC money. You don't lose the money, you don't lose your assets, you don't lose your position, you don't lose your credibility in the society. So and that's the blocking part. So unless that happens, and that is something that Taiwan, especially because of the language abilities and forensic abilities and things like that, is in a very good place to help with. I mean, even just collaborations between Taiwanese think tanks or Taiwanese media and media or think tanks in places like Solomon's, the kind of track 2 type stuff, just giving them the accurate information that they need to start to impose cost, so that on that level playing field, because what you're saying is absolutely dead on. It's not a level playing field. But how do you level the playing field? You don't, if they're bribing, you don't meet the bribes. You make it so they can't bribe and distort the society and destroy democracy in the process. And so that sort of thing would be helpful. On the Panuelo thing, he wrote 3 letters about China. And by the time that one that was published on March, I think it was March 10th, yes, he wasn't being reelected, but in the letter, he details that he had been he had been in negotiations with Taiwan for a while. I personally think, because I don't blame Taiwan for this at all. And what he was doing was he was actually willing to take the political hit for it. And knowing the personal cost, it was actually a kind of an act of bravery to make it public and to say, look, we didn't complete it while I was in office, but I'm going to be in office. That was March. He was in office until May, and I'm willing to risk this. I personally think if, for example, the State Department had come out in favor of it, then the dynamic would have changed substantially. And that gets to a very core question, which is, and it's a hard question and it hurts, but I think it's worth asking before anybody else puts their head on the chopping block like Panuelo, because you've got people like Daniel Sudani Malaita who is the one who issued the Auki communique, and he's out of office now. The federal government took away his seat specifically because he wouldn't back China's One China policy, China's version of the One China policy, which means that the electorate of the Solomons was vetoed by Beijing and who they can select to represent them. And then you have Panuelo and others. So the question is, if there is a country now that is willing to switch to Taiwan, and the reasons Panuelo gave were very clear. For example, if you recognize China's, and you have a Chinese embassy in your country, you basically have a spy base in your country. You have a forward operating base for political warfare operations.
Yeah.
If you have a Taiwanese embassy, you have a partner, somebody that wants to help you develop. Very, very fundamentally different. So if a country is willing to do that, what do you think is going to be the reaction of the rest of the world? Forget Taiwan, but the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't agree more, Cleo, that there's fundamental differences. And I think what the best way forward on these issues is there needs to be greater coordination and communication, not only between Taiwan and these Pacific countries, but also between other like-minded stakeholders as well. Australia, New Zealand, Japan has done great things in the region, particularly in the Solomon Islands, actually, but also the United States. And I do think that there needs to be greater support given to Pacific leaders that are willing to buckle the trend and say tough things and say tough truths. And I don't mean, support as necessarily resources or funding, but really political support and support for them in showing that like-minded countries have their back and that there is more that they can do together with us as democracies and countries that share their values and ideals than there are with China. So with that, Cleo, I know it is very late where you're at, and we're very, very grateful for your time. And so India and the Pacific Islands are truly important partners for Taiwan, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to share your expertise and perspectives on how we can enhance those relationships. Thank you all for turning in to Global Voices on Taiwan. Thank you, Cleo, for your time.
To ensure you don't miss out on exciting insights from the island nation's captivating stories, make sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast or social media platform. You can also check out our full video on YouTube. Take care and stay safe.